In our learning journey, we all make mistakes. Sometimes, these slip-ups are hard to spot, and that's when a more experienced buddy's insight can be useful. Today, we're ramping up the hands-on learning by directly addressing corrections in your submissions. For starters, we've got two portraits that topped the polls in our community. The first one is Emma Watson's, sketched in pencil, and the second one is made on a graphic tablet. Let's jump right in. I'll kick things off by highlighting and rectifying any errors in the sketch. This portrait is actually pretty good. Some might even call it a high-level piece, though I'm surprised it was chosen over more straightforward options. I was kinda expecting something less complex. Anyway, moving forward. Before tweaking a few things, I've got to admit, the drawing does a fair job capturing the original's essence. It's based on a full body shot with exceptional detail. Kudos to the creator for how she's framed the face. The features and proportions are on point, and the tones and shadows are smoothly blended. Now let's talk about some mistakes here. There are three main ones. The most glaring is the facial symmetry. It's slightly off, particularly around the neck and hair, plus a few subtle anatomical missteps. Proportions are the first hurdle. They're not immediately apparent, but they're there. Next, the portrait's tonality needs to be fixed. When you put it side by side with a monochrome photo, it's clear the details, especially in the hair, are lacking. And lastly, there's the matter of some hasty cross-hatching in places, resulting in uneven patches. I'll dive deeper into these during the drawing process. Let's start with proportions. It's tough to correct a finished piece, so it's best to practice on less crucial parts to gauge the depth of your shading. That's why I started with the ear. What's off about it? In the original, it's a tad larger and more angled. Think of it like The Hobbit. That's the vibe we're going for in this drawing session. I've toned down the hatching a bit, but not entirely. It's more visible now since I used a blotter for erasing. It's a neat tool. You can shape it however you like, and it erases softly, just enough to avoid damaging the paper. A few streaks were left initially, but no worries there. The darker areas around the ear have already blended everything smoothly. I add the tones gradually, using a sharp pencil for precision. This method prevents any unwanted marks. You can see how I sped up the correction process in the video, since the whole thing took a solid 6 hours. That's about the time it takes for me to create a quality portrait from scratch. Now, about the corrections. I revisited the ear and improved its shape based on anatomical accuracy, and tweaked the hair around the temple a bit. The difference in the initial stages might not be obvious, but if you compare the before and after, you'll see the transformation in shape, drawing quality, and texture. The ear might look slightly blurry now, but it'll balance out in the end. Next up, I'll tackle the key features. I noticed the face's axis shifted, pulling the eyes, lips, and especially the nose to the left. That's my current focus. For a closer look, I zoomed in on the drawing to highlight some key interesting details. After partially erasing the left nostril, I redrew the edges before erasing further as the blotter allowed. A quick tip, rather than rubbing with the blotter, dampen it slightly for better control. So this kind of form is the most easy to use. A blotter gets dirty fast, so keep reshaping it for effective erasing. When making corrections, it's better to erase them minimally. So in the nose area, I remove only small sections and use the previous lines as a base. Along with reshaping and repositioning the nose, I'm also smoothing out the tones, just like I did with the ear. It's a bit tedious, involving short strokes and multiple layers. I'll delve into that more later. For now, I'm moving on to refining the eyes. The right eye in this drawing needs more fine-tuning. It's noticeably out of alignment and requires additional corrections. The biggest issue is the iris's placement. It's not quite right and far too dark, making it a challenge to erase. To address this, I'm using a Monozero eraser, known for its precision. My goal is to stay true to the original sketch as much as possible, only making edits where necessary, like shifting certain elements toward the right. The left eye is a bit easier to handle. It needs only slight adjustments in the iris's size and shape. I've also improved the eyebrows and lightened the freckles, which were initially drawn too boldly and didn't look natural. Next up, the lips need some attention. The central line isn't quite right, and the lips themselves are too sharply defined and overly full. I'm working on making them appear more natural and softer. Overall, the facial features are shaping up nicely, but the proportions still need some tweaking. In the original, Emma's pose is different, affecting the curvature of her neck, which now looks like it needs to be enlarged. However, I'm limited by two things here, the black straps and the layout of the portrait, so I can only make minor adjustments. The facial features already look much better, but I'll keep refining them a little bit. Correcting all parts clarifies the overall direction, but there are some technical limitations since this is a remake, so it's hard to do my best. Now, onto the hair, which I find the most challenging. I dislike them the most here. The first step is correcting the hairline. In the photo, it's fuller and wider, especially on the right side. I've toned down the right side a bit and completely reworked the left side's contour. Before doing this, I blended in the inner part of the strands by erasing them in advance. Aside from the outline, I don't like the texture and tone of the hair. There are many gaps in the texture. It's smooth but has spots and messy strokes. But the tone is simply lacking, and what is there isn't smooth enough. So I'm gradually building up and smoothing out, working on both tone and texture simultaneously. The hairstyle is very convenient for drawing. It's cute and relatively simple, without 1,000 strands. But there's one tricky part, a large smooth transition into the shadows of this big area. Specifically here, near the parting, there should be a dark patch, then lightening toward the center, and darkening again on the left side. It's not easy because the strokes must be made lengthwise, not across. By the way, there was a tutorial on such a hairstyle on the channel. For those interested, you can check it out and figure out how it's done. Well, the hair is generally ready, and the tone transition is there too. The tone itself has become darker, the texture is completely different, and the strokes on it are there but not as rough. And small strands have become much more noticeable. That is, all this separated by dark, soft stripes. For more realism, I added a lot of sticking out hairs around the perimeter, and I think it turned out very cool in the end. Next, I need to correct the skin tone. It's also lacking here, as I've mentioned before, and it's a bit uneven. Now, with some pieces already prepared, this has become more apparent. I want to show you up close how the work on the texture and tone is progressing. You can probably see how sharp my pencil is and how I'm using fine strokes to shade. It's almost like precision work. I often have to shade in the highlights, or vice versa, between the spots to smooth out the tone. It requires quite an accurate touch. I have done something similar in my previous drawings. The challenge also lies in not forgetting about the large shadows and volumes, because they shape the contours of the face, which affects realism. So remember, large shadows are more important than fine texture. These shadows can only be seen if you look at the drawing from a distance. You probably feel that a portrait is perceived differently up close and from afar. Therefore, when working, you need to alternate between drawing up close and inspecting it from a distance. Right before your eyes, the drawing's smoothness is improving. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the ear can't remain so blurred. But the neck, on the contrary, seems too sharp, too blotchy, which I will correct. The biggest mistake here is the shadow under the chin. It's just drawn as a thick line. That's not correct because it looks unrealistic. I had to soften it with lighter strokes and create a smooth gradient tone downwards. Fortunately, there should be a large shadow cast by the head, and in the original version, it wasn't sufficiently defined. Regarding the texture, I decided to make the strokes go in one direction, following the form as if circling. Before this, there were many cross-hatching intersections here. I wouldn't say that's wrong. Such a technique is often used in academic portraits to push the form of the neck into the background, making the face stand out more prominently. But what I have here is a kind of futuristic approach with uniform detailing, so I'm doing it as I do. The neck, like the face, also lacked tone. I've added it, and I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the tone should be present not only in the shadows, but also in the light areas. Because our skin is not white, it has color, and this aspect of the drawing was lacking, including in the lower part of the neck near the chest. The last element of the drawing I adjusted was the straps. They seem not dark enough relative to the new contrast. And I also tweaked a bunch of various details here, but those are not very significant. Well, in the end, we have this portrait. I hope my efforts were not in vain, and that you also prefer this revised version. Let me remind you of the main things I corrected. These are the proportions, silhouette, added tones for contrast, smoothed the shadows, and adjusted the details. Alright then, the second drawing, I will be correcting it using a different technique. As you may have noticed, the first one was simply traced from a photo. There, I tried to copy as accurately as possible, But here, I want to do a creative reinterpretation, not just replicate the photo. So, what are the mistakes this portrait has? Comparing it to the photograph, not everything is accurate here, but that's okay, because this is a creative reinterpretation and digital art. However, there are a couple of anatomical aspects that concern me, so I decided to correct them a bit first. Initially, I didn't have the project file for the drawing. The author didn't save it, so I had to work with the completed file, which added complexity. But more on that later. Correcting the proportions in a digital drawing is much easier, and the most convenient way to do this is through plasticity tools. What did I correct here? Again, the overall silhouette, namely the hairstyle, the shape of the cheek, and the chin. In terms of facial features, the right eye and lips bothered me the most, so I spent quite a bit of time on them. And I also tweaked many other small details. To better understand what to correct, it's helpful to mirror the image. It's a very cool technique, not just for digital painting, so definitely give it a try. The result of all these corrections might not be very impressive to you, but firstly, these aren't all the proportion adjustments yet. And secondly, my goal wasn't to copy perfectly from a photo, or to create a sophisticated anatomical structure. I should remind you that in this drawing, my focus was on the artistic aspect, primarily on the composition and color solutions. That's what I'm going to work on now. I'm not at all fond of the background of the portrait because it's very intense and textured, drawing too much attention. Overall, it's not quite right. I decided not just to change it, but to use a frame composition. The frame will be circular, and the girl will appear to be observing us from within it. I chose a more subdued background color, but within the original color triad. Currently, I'm experimenting with the angle. In the original, it seemed excessively steep to me. Also, I slightly altered the colors in the layer with the girl, reducing saturation and opting for warmer shades. Okay, now that I've resolved the main compositional and color challenges, I'm moving to the next stage. Since I have to work not with a layered project but with a simple photo, a downloaded file, I need to create layers. This can be easily done using a lasso, and then those layers need processing. Working with such a textured surface isn't feasible, so I plan to create my texture, meaning the base has to be smoothed out. This can be done in various ways. The simplest tool is the smudge tool, but in this particular case, I used a soft round brush and an eyedropper, because I wanted not just to smooth out the tone, but also to finely adjust the colors to make them look very appealing. I also made minor adjustments to the shadows, tweaked the eyebrows, and much more. It's impossible to list everything in such a short video. A very important point, again about color, I decided to make the eyes blue, because they match the background better. Green eyes were completely out of place here, not fitting into the color triad of red, blue, and yellow. For such significant color changes, the hue and saturation tool is most convenient. Regarding the other two elements, hair and clothing, I changed them even more drastically. I smoothed the hair almost completely, preserving only the general form and shadows. With the sweater, it's the same process, plus I altered the folds differently. You might notice now that the drawing has become softer, although some might not see it. Here's a photo for comparison from the very beginning. These compositional and color choices are not only more harmonious, but also solve another artistic challenge. The girl has a very charming smile, and the colors of the painting create the right mood. In the original, everything looked somewhat more somber. Additionally, this radiant smile and the very image of the girl are like sunshine, glowing brightly. Hence, the placement of the drawing within a circle is very fitting. See, we're starting to see some meanings emerge in the composition. Next, most of my work involves adding more details, especially in the hair, because right now, it just looks like an indistinct clump. So, I begin by adding a new layer, making large blurred strokes with a soft, textured brush. These represent the main large strands. They don't show texture yet, but rather the small shapes and the curls. This is where the original had an error. The situation here is almost the same as in the previous portrait. The entire left side of the hairstyle is essentially one large curved strand. With this kind of lighting, it should be lighter in the middle than at the top and bottom. And this transition of color should be gradual. In the original, this was not achieved. The tone was uneven, and there was a lack of detail. The hair had no texture. In my work, I will deal with textures at the very end. For now, I've just added a few stray hairs. Now, the face. It also needs more detailing. I worked a bit on the lips and teeth. There are issues with the teeth. The right side is too stretched out, and the angle of the teeth is incorrect. They should be more vertical on the right side. I'll fix this later. Also, I worked on the finer details like texture, eyelashes, and eyebrows. In general, the whole drawing lacked detail. It was initially too smooth, too blurred. It was probably drawn with a couple of standard round brushes, maybe even in one layer. This is evident from the gaps between the girl and the background. Sometimes I also paint in one layer, but it's very challenging. At least it's more difficult than doing it in several layers, which is much more effective. I have nothing against round brushes. If used skillfully, they can create an excellent drawing. But if you're struggling, try my 3 textured brushes for the main work. But right now, I'm focusing on the smile, addressing that tooth issue. It was a remnant from the original drawing. In fact, I couldn't completely conquer it, but it looks much better now, I believe. The work is nearing completion. I'm making a few more adjustments and starting to add textures. For this, I have a special brush. You have to be careful with such tools because textures look good when used in moderation. I also decided to play around interestingly with the background, using a special brush for clouds. And for hair, I have another special brush. Here, I apply textures in a separate layer so I can blur or tweak it, as the drawing doesn't turn out super detailed, and sharp, detailed hair would look somewhat out of place. Remember the important rules. Refinement and detailing are good ways to highlight an element and create focus on it. Pay attention to it. So it's better to work well on the face, and for the hair, either do the same or draw the closer bundles more distinctly, while softening the periphery. Due to my involvement in alterations, I didn't have the opportunity to do everything correctly from the beginning, so I had to play around with the tools for blurring and sharpening, sometimes reducing or adding, as for the frame. I decided to make it in a yellow shade for now, but not just a smooth, even color. That would be too simple. Our eye perceives such an image as artificial, so here I made a little magic with textures. And that's all for now. Thank you to everyone for watching to the end. I hope the constant change in scale didn't confuse you. This is how the 2 versions of the work look in comparison. Write in the comments how you find it. Hope to see you again. Bye.